Good afternoon. My name is Julia Menino, and for my project today, I will be discussing 3 different theorists and scholars, as well as their theories on racism and elite discourses in the United States. These 3 theorists are David Roediger, Thune van Dyck, and Eduardo Bonilla Silva. Let us first begin with David Roediger. Roediger is a distinguished professor of American Studies and History at Kansas University. In his essay, Whiteness and Ethnicity and the History of White Ethnics in the United States, Roediger highlights the differences between whiteness and ethnicity, arguing that some U.S. immigrants chose to identify as white over a period of time, while other, quote, ethnic groups did not have the same luxury. He expands this point by creating a middle ground between ethnic and white, referring to the, quote, white ethnics. He creates a spectrum for his audience to differentiate between the categories of white, and in turn to consider what it means to not be white at all. By doing so, Roediger is effectively breaking down stereotypes of certain ethnicities, as well as addressing the concepts of passing privilege. One's ethnicity, he argues, does not dictate their level of, quote, whiteness. Now, personally, I find that these sometimes rigid concepts are easy to understand through the use of satire. Additionally, stereotypes become easier to break down with the use of satire, as an audience, a special regard for a white audience, may be uncomfortable with said information. Satire is a way to almost laugh at the absurdity of some of the things that we do and say within our culture. I'm a huge fan of Chris Rock, and I love this clip very much. It's from the 2012 election between Obama and Romney, and by highlighting stereotypes of Black Americans in the United States, Chris Rock is able to effectively break down them for our viewers to see.
Chris Rock with a special message for white people. In times like these, you need a white president you can trust. And that white president's name is Barack Obama. Let's take a look at the facts. For the first 2/3 of his life, Barack Obama was known as Barry, which is the 3rd whitest name on earth, right after Cody and Jeff. And these are the white people who raised Barry: Madeline and Stanley Dunham. They're so white they have to wear sunglasses because they're hurting each other's eyes. After college, Barry went into black neighborhoods in Chicago to try to organize people. How white is that? Black people don't go into black communities. We don't have to. We're already there. Look at him, playing golf, body surfing, wearing mom jeans, dancing with Ellen. Barack Obama supports gay marriage. Most black men don't even support straight marriage. President Obama has a dog. But is it a pit bull? Is it a Rottweiler? No, it's a Portuguese water dog. And he named him Bo, after one of the Dukes of Hazzard. And let's not forget, Barack Obama is whiter than Snooki, the Tanning Mom, and Tara Reid. Even Mitt Romney is blacker than Obama. This is Obama's family. And these are the Romneys. Look at that. Kids, cousins, aunts, uncles. Mitt Romney's family has more people in it than a Tyler Perry movie. And if you're still not convinced, check this out.
And so you can see here that Chris Rock is effectively breaking down stereotypes of his own identity in an attempt to help those, such as white Americans, process this information in a way that's more comfortable, in a way in which they are able to see both their privilege as well as suppression over other groups in our country. So similarly, we'll be discussing racism denials, and Van Dyck takes care of that. In his analysis, he is a scholar in the fields of linguistics, and for the purposes of today, we will be discussing his critical discourse analysis. Van Dyck argues that the idea of not wanting to be called a, quote, racist makes it difficult for many to see color in public spaces. This xenophobia stems from the desire to keep those considered, quote, natural in a position of power, while associations with and discriminations towards minority groups facilitate more fear. So a quote that I've pulled from Van Dyke is, "Besides the discursive and political strategy of populism, which is very prominent in such debates, we also find the element of euphemism. We are not racist, only worried." This is an example of an elite discourse strategy. Van Dyke argues that these elite discourse strategies will be posed as excuses of sorts, and his point may be understood as a cycle. By denying racism, white people think they're helping to close the inequality gap, when they are merely reiterating their white dominance as they have the luxury of ignoring their own privilege, in turn creating more racism. So coding these denials, how can we tell what we're seeing as a racist denial? So this picture seen above is from 1960 Birmingham, Alabama, and you can see on the sign, "Race mixing is communism." Back then, it was outward racism. It was overt racism. There was no questioning. There was no name calling. It was very prominent. And now, this is an article from seen below from 2015, published by the New York Times. "Parents pass along the bias against interracial marriage." And below you will find a quote that I incorporated from a family member of mine, someone that I do know personally. "I'm not racist, I just think it would be really hard on the children." Now, this encourages us, white people as well as Black Americans, to consider what it means to have interracial marriage, and furthermore, what it means to disapprove, if you will, of interracial marriage, where these denials come from, how they are passed down, and furthermore, how they're institutionalized and how children are socialized into these ideas every day. So some satire again. Again, I find it very helpful to read things like this that get our brain thinking and that get us laughing and that make light bulbs go off in our heads that make us say, how did I not figure this out before? So up on the far left, how can I have privilege if sometimes people are mean to me? If we want to be really honest, when I came to college, that's probably the answer that I would have given you if you had called me privileged. It doesn't make sense to some white people, point blank. It doesn't make sense. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I'll ask you all to consider the definition of privilege as being not at a disadvantage. You see, Vince Vaughn in the bottom right says affirmative action is racist. Again, with this word privilege, sometimes as white Americans, we fail to realize that something in our everyday being is somehow valued more than what's in another's everyday being. And this can be hard. This can be hard for us to see because whiteness is not necessarily recognized as a race, thus normalizing it into being the standard, the status quo. But then on the bottom left, you get when white people say, quote, "I'm not racist, my best friend is Black." This is who they're talking about. Again, a picture of Raven-Symoné, Disney Channel, very fair skin, something we can laugh at. But are we laughing just because she has fair skin? Or are we also laughing because white people continue to say ridiculous things like, "I'm not a racist, my best friend is Black"? I encourage you all to think how many times you've heard someone say that, or even how many times you've said it yourself. And finally, the top right, white people are the real victims. I just feel like there might be some racism left in society. That's because you're the real racist. Dr. King would be so disappointed. And I think this shows us a lot about the white mentality and how sometimes we fail to understand the plight of others as our privilege is what blinds us. So the last theorist I'll be discussing today is Eduardo Bonilla Silva. Bonilla Silva is an American political sociologist, and he presents the ideology that race itself is socially constructed. He continues to argue that there is this, quote, new racism, colorblind racism, he argues, is subtle, institutional, and yet many whites do not consider themselves to be racist. His text discusses how this colorblindness produces a, quote, artificial image of progress. Colorblindness, he argues, is a state in which race is totally ignored. He explores the ways in which colorblind racism is formed, socialized, normalized, and even defended in the United States today. He delves into how colorblind racism may be employed by a multitude of social and cultural groups, some of which are marginalized themselves. So I found this to be a perfect example of what he means by colorblindness, while also incorporating satire. I do not see race. I'm a good person. Translation, I'm going to use my place of privilege to refute and deny the suffering of those who do not have white privilege, while at the same time erasing their personal and cultural history. And this is precisely what colorblindness does. Unfortunately, in America, by ignoring the problem, white people think they're, right here, being a good person, saying, I treat everyone the same, when in reality, these differences are essential to acknowledge, especially to one's face, as it shows that you're woke, that you are aware, and you're going to do something progressive with the privilege that you have. Again, these are some media examples of how white privilege works. The real reason white people say all lives matter. And at the bottom, it's actually a cartoon that I created myself. All lives matter. That's what we've been telling you. And I think the biggest thing that people fail to realize with all lives matter is that at the end of the day, it is a simple retort to the hashtag Black Lives Matter. This retort is a sheer example of both colorblindness and racism denials, as it attempts to fabricate an inclusive ideology between peoples in the United States, when that very much isn't the case. In fact, if all lives did matter, there would be no need to highlight Black lives mattering or the plight of Black lives not mattering. And I think that, again, this is a denial in the sense that it is not so obvious in these terms to white Americans that may not be experiencing these issues firsthand, or again, have the luxury of ignoring their privilege and the cultural injustices of others. So in conclusion, race is socially constructed, and there's no biological way for us to define it. Any all or white Black person knows is what they're socialized into, and through the exploration of white defensiveness and its rich relationship with colorblind racism, patterns are made visible, answering how and why society came to a point where it stopped acknowledging race. If the privileged remain removed and hostile, attitude towards racism will not progress, and the oppressed will remain in a standstill. For this reason, an evaluation of racial discourse needs to be had. Elite discourse, racist denials, and the facilitation of colorblindness needs to stop being ignored. And now I'll leave you with this picture. Race is behind us, race still matters. As I strongly feel that as growing up as a white person in the United States, I was taught my entire life that racial inequalities were in the past. I was taught that slavery happened. I was taught that segregation was in the 60s, but now we're all equal. I encourage you all from today on to consider what it means to be white and what it means to be of color. And I encourage you to consider your whiteness as being visible, both to yourself as well as others. I find it immensely important to be incorporated into education. This is why I'm here today, and I hope you will take this information even further. Thank you for your time.